when a man in a worn gray hoodie and old scuffed boots quietly folded himself into an economy seat on a Tuesday afternoon flight from New York to Los Angeles. Nobody paid much attention. Nobody except the man sitting directly behind him. That man took one long look at the hoodie, one long look at the faded jeans, one long look at the beat-up canvas backpack shoved under the seat, and he decided right then and there, without a single conversation, without knowing anything about the person in front of him, that this man did not belong. So he called the flight attendant over, and he said loud enough for 3 rows to hear that the passenger in front of him was an embarrassment, that his clothes looked cheap, that a person dressed like that had no business sitting near him on a plane. The flight attendant smiled politely and walked away. Nah, but she did not forget, because she had recognized the man in the gray hoodie the moment he stepped on board. She knew exactly who was sitting in that economy seat, asking for nothing, bothering no one, quietly reading a worn paperback book about how to be a good person. So she picked up the interphone, and she called the cockpit. What happened next stopped the entire cabin cold. A pilot, a man who had been flying for 19 years, stepped out of the cockpit in the middle of the flight, walked the full length of the plane, and stopped at row 22. But here is the part that will absolutely floor you. The reason that Captain walked out of his cockpit had nothing to do with the rude passenger behind him. It had nothing to do with the hoodie or the boots or any of it. It had everything to do with a hospital room in Portland, Oregon, a Tuesday in February 3 years earlier, and a conversation that nobody on that plane, not even the man in seat 22B, knew had changed someone's life forever. Stay with me through this entire video, because by the end, you will not be thinking about Keanu Reeves, the movie star. You will be thinking about the man underneath all of that, the real one, the one in the gray hoodie who sat in economy and asked for nothing. And somehow, without trying, without announcing it, without ever once asking for credit, changed everything anyway. The pilot walked out of the cockpit in the middle of the flight. That almost never happens. When Captain David Okafor stepped through that narrow door at 34,000 feet somewhere over Kansas, every head in the cabin turned. Passengers pulled out their earbuds. A baby stopped crying, like a teenage boy paused his video game with his thumb still on the button. Even the hum of the engine seemed to go quiet, as if the plane itself wanted to hear what was about to happen. Captain Okafor was a tall man, broad shoulders, a dark blue uniform pressed so clean it looked like someone had ironed it 5 minutes before takeoff. He had the kind of face that made you feel safe. Steady dark eyes, a jaw like carved wood, hands that looked like they had held 1,000 storms and kept flying straight anyway. He walked slowly down the aisle. Row 30, row 28, row 26, row 24. He stopped at row 22. And then Captain David Okafor, a man who had flown for United Airlines for 19 years, a man who had crossed the Atlantic 214 times, and a man who had once landed a plane safely through a thunderstorm over Denver with a cracked instrument panel, extended his right hand toward the man sitting in seat 22B. "Sir," Captain Okafor said, and his deep voice filled the whole cabin like a warm bell. "It is a true honor to have you on my flight today." The man in seat 22B looked up slowly. He had been sitting quietly the entire flight. His long legs were folded like a road map into the tight economy seat. His dark eyes were calm and a little tired, the way eyes get when someone has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. He wore a faded gray hoodie, soft from too many washes, old blue jeans with a small tear at the left knee, scuffed brown boots that had clearly walked 1,000 different miles across 1,000 different floors. No first-class seat. No assistant walking behind him. No bodyguard standing nearby with crossed arms and an earpiece. Just a worn canvas backpack jammed under the seat in front of him, and a beat-up paperback book resting open on his knee. He blinked once. Then he smiled, that slow, quiet smile that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. Like a light turning on in an old house that everyone had forgotten was beautiful. He reached up and shook the captain's hand. The whole cabin watched, and that was the moment the man in seat 23A, The man who, 40 minutes earlier, had leaned toward the flight attendant and said, loudly enough for 3 rows to hear, that the person sitting in front of him looked like he'd gotten dressed inside a dumpster, that his clothes were an embarrassment, that a man dressed like that did not belong in polite company, felt something go very cold inside his chest. Because the man in seat 22B, the man the captain had crossed the cockpit to honor, the man sitting in economy class with a worn hoodie, scuffed boots, and no complaints at all, was Keanu Reeves. But the real story didn't start there. It started 3 years earlier in a hospital in Portland, Oregon, on a Tuesday in February that nobody was supposed to remember. But first, you need to understand who was on that plane before any of that, because every person sitting in that cabin carried a piece of this story, and not one of them knew it yet. Not the flight attendant. Not the elderly woman in row 24. Not the man in row 23 who was still straightening his very expensive watch. Not even Keanu. So go back. You can go back to the beginning of the day, before the plane, before the hoodie, before the captain's steady hand reached across the aisle and changed everything. Keanu Charles Reeves was born on September 2nd, 1964, in Beirut, Lebanon. That sentence alone should tell you something. A boy born in a city that the whole world would later watch burn on the television news. A boy who grew up moving from Beirut to Sydney to New York to Toronto, following his mother Patricia through cities and countries the way some kids follow a river, just trying to find where it settles. His father Samuel left when Keanu was 3 years old. 3 years old. Just old enough to notice a chair that is always empty. Just old enough to understand, without words, that someone who was supposed to stay didn't. That leaving shaped him in ways he has never fully explained in any interview. You can see it, though, if you watch closely. In every character he has ever played, there is a man who keeps going even after the ground disappears beneath his feet. A man who is fluent in loss but refuses to let loss be the last word. He became an actor in Toronto as a teenager. He became a star by 30. He became eventually one of the most recognized human beings on the entire planet. And then loss found him again. In 1999, his daughter, a baby girl named Ava Archer Syme Reeves, was born still. There are no words in any language that carry the full weight of that sentence, so this story will not try to dress it up. She was here and then she was not. And Keanu and his girlfriend, Jennifer Syme, had already loved her completely before they ever got the chance to meet her. 18 months after that, Jennifer died in a car accident on Cahuenga Boulevard in Los Angeles. May 2nd, 2001. She was 28 years old. Keanu kept going. He didn't disappear. He didn't stop showing up to the world. He put one scuffed boot in front of the other every single day, even when people could see in his quiet, dark eyes that the walking cost him something real. People who worked beside him told the same kinds of stories, over and over for years. How he quietly gave up millions of dollars of his salary from the Matrix sequels so the costume and special effects crews could receive larger bonuses. How he bought Harley-Davidson motorcycles for the stuntmen who had risked their bodies for those films. How he rode the New York City subway like a regular person, gave up his seat to strangers without being asked, sat cross-legged on the subway floor when there was nowhere left to sit, and did not seem to find this remarkable in any way. How he ate lunch with construction workers on film sets. How he learned the names of every grip, every gaffer, every assistant on every project he worked. How he held doors open. How he talked to the janitor the same exact way he talked to the director. How he almost never talked about any of it. On a Tuesday morning in October of 2019, Keanu Reeves arrived at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City and boarded United Airlines Flight 863 to Los Angeles. He had an early meeting the next morning, quiet, low-key, the kind of meeting that did not need a first-class seat to feel important. And he wore his gray hoodie, his old blue jeans, his scuffed brown boots. He carried his worn canvas backpack, the one a late friend had given him years ago that he refused to replace. Because some things you keep not for what they are, but for what they mean. He found seat 22B. He folded himself in. He pulled out his worn paperback copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. A book about how to keep going when the world gives you every reason not to, and he opened it to where he had left off. He asked the flight attendant, a young woman named Priya Sharma for one thing, just a cup of water. Priya brought it. She had recognized him immediately. The way you recognize a mountain, slowly and then all at once. But she said nothing, because his whole posture said, "Please, just treat me like a person," and she was very good at her job. He thanked her, eyes twice. He did not recline his seat too far. He did not spread his elbows past his armrest. He did not call for the attendant again. He did not order food from the cart or ask for a pillow or complain about the air being too cold or the seat being too small, even though the seat was genuinely quite small for a man of his height. He asked for nothing. He would not know for another 40 minutes that the man sitting directly behind him had already made up his mind about exactly what kind of man he was. Marcus Holt was 44 years old and he had opinions. That is not an accusation. Everyone has opinions. But Marcus Holt had the particular kind of opinions that needed to be shared immediately at full volume, with the complete expectation that everyone within earshot would nod along and agree. He was not a man who held things quietly inside himself. Holding things quietly felt, to Marcus, like losing. He was a regional director for a logistics company headquartered in Greenwich, Connecticut. He earned good money. He knew he earned good money because he found careful ways to mention it in most conversations. The house in Greenwich, the ski trips to Aspen, the car in the driveway, the club membership, the watch on his left wrist that cost more than most people's monthly rent and which he adjusted often as though it needed constant checking. He was not a bad man, the way villains in movies are bad. He never planned cruelty the way you plan a trip or a meeting. He simply moved through the world with the careless, wide-legged confidence of someone who had never once been told no in a way that actually stuck. And somewhere along the road between his first paycheck and his current watch, he had made a quiet mistake that a lot of people make without noticing. He had confused how much a person was worth with how much a person owned. He had booked the aisle seat in row 23 specifically because he liked what an aisle seat said about a person. You were not trapped. You were not squeezed between strangers, waiting for permission to stand. You had chosen your position deliberately. That mattered to Marcus. The man in seat 22B had been the very first thing Marcus noticed after he'd settled in and buckled up. That hoodie, that particular shade of faded gray that only comes from a garment being washed so many times it has essentially given up trying to be a color. Those jeans with a small tear at the knee. That backpack, that beat-up, travel-worn, a genuinely battered canvas backpack, shoved under the seat like it contained nothing more valuable than a packed lunch. Marcus had looked at all of it. He had looked at the boots. He had done the full survey with the expression of a man who has reached into his coat pocket and found someone else's used tissue. He waited until the seatbelt sign clicked off at cruising altitude. Then he pressed the call button. Priya Sharma came down the aisle the way she always did, with the smooth, practiced calm of someone who has managed every variety of human behavior at altitude and come out the other side still smiling. She had dark eyes, a small gold stud earring, and a smile that was completely genuine even when it had to work very hard to stay that way. "Can I help you, sir?" she said. Marcus did not lower his voice. The gentleman in front of me," he said, tilting his head toward seat 22B, "is dressed like he's on his way to a yard sale. I'm just wondering, does this airline have any kind of standard? Because honestly, it's a little embarrassing. I don't know where he thinks he's going dressed like that, but this is not a city bus." Priya Sharma's smile did not move a single millimeter. "All passengers are welcome aboard our flights, regardless of their attire, sir," she said. "I'm sure they are," Marcus said. "But there's a baseline, isn't there? Look at those boots. Those are work boots, outdoor boots. He looks like he's come straight off a construction site." He paused. "It reflects on the airline." In seat 24A, directly across the aisle, a retired school librarian from Bozeman, Montana named Ruth Calloway looked up from her book. She peered over the top of her reading glasses at Marcus Holt with the slow, quiet, utterly devastating expression of a woman who had spent 31 years teaching children how to be decent human beings and could recognize the opposite without any effort at all. She said nothing. She simply looked. Marcus Holt did not notice. In seat 22B, Keanu Reeves had not turned around. He had not stiffened. He had not shifted in his seat or gripped his book any tighter. His shoulders were relaxed. His head was still. It was possible, just barely possible, that he had not heard a word. But the cabin was small, and Marcus had not been quiet. Keanu turned a page. Priya Sharma leaned in slightly toward Marcus, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" Marcus looked one more time at the hoodie. He looked at the boots. He gave a small, slow shake of his head. The specific head shake of a man who has accepted that the world will keep disappointing him. "Just make sure the people around me are appropriate," he said. "That's all I'm asking." Priya Sharma nodded once. Professionally. Completely. She turned and walked back toward the forward galley. As she passed seat 22B, her eyes dropped, just for half a second, to the man sitting there with his worn paperback and his water cup and his complete, unbroken stillness. Something moved across her face. Not anger, something older and quieter than anger. She kept walking. In the galley, she stood for a moment with her hand resting on the interphone. She picked it up. She set it back down. She stood very still, looking at nothing, her jaw tight. Then she picked it up again, and she pressed the button for the cockpit. Ruth Calloway was 71 years old, and she had seen a great many things. She had seen kindness arrive in the most unlikely shapes. In the way a 7-year-old boy once spent his entire lunch hour helping a classmate learn to tie his shoes, refusing to eat until it was done. In the way a widowed husband had kept bringing flowers to school every Friday for a full year after his wife died, because his wife had loved the teacher and he wanted the teacher to know she was still loved by someone. She had also seen the other kind of thing, the careless kind, the loud, comfortable, completely unaware cruelty of people who had somewhere along the way mistaken their confidence for their character. She recognized both kinds immediately. After 31 years in a school library, her recognition was as automatic as breathing. She had spotted Keanu Reeves the moment she'd boarded the plane. She was 71, not invisible to the world. She had watched Speed in a movie theater in the summer of 1994, sitting beside her late husband Gerald, who had laughed so hard during the bus sequence that he'd knocked his entire large popcorn off his knee, and neither of them had cared even slightly. She had watched The Matrix on DVD with her grown son in 2001, pausing it twice to ask questions and refusing to apologize for that. She had, more recently, watched both John Wick films with her 12-year-old grandson Tommy on a rainy Saturday in Bozeman, sharing a bowl of microwave popcorn under a shared blanket, Tommy covering his eyes at the loud parts and then immediately uncovering them so he wouldn't miss anything. Tommy was in seat 24B right now, asleep against her shoulder, his mouth slightly open, a blue travel blanket tucked around him like a cocoon, his sneakers sitting neatly side by side under the seat in front of him because Ruth had raised his mother right and his mother had raised him right. Ruth had not said a single word to Keanu when she boarded. She wouldn't. That was not her business and not her place. Famous people on planes deserved the same quiet dignity as everyone else. More, maybe, because they got so little of it everywhere else. But she had watched him settle in. She had watched him pull the worn paperback from his backpack, and she had noticed, because Ruth Calloway always noticed what people chose to read, that it was Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a book about bearing difficulty with grace, and about doing good quietly and expecting nothing back, about how the obstacle in your path is not the end of the road, but the road itself. She had thought, yes, that is exactly the book that man would carry. She had then watched Marcus Holt speak to Priya Sharma. She had heard every word. The cabin was not large and Marcus had not tried to be discreet, and Ruth's hearing, despite her age, remained precise and reliable. She had looked at Marcus over the top of her reading glasses with the full weight of 31 years behind her eyes. He had not noticed. Now she looked back at the man in seat 22B. The gray hoodie, the still shoulders, the page turning with complete unhurried calm. She studied him the way she had studied thousands of children in difficult moments, looking not at what he was doing, but at what it was costing him to do it, looking at the space between the stillness and the feeling underneath it. He turned another page. Ruth Calloway pressed her lips together softly. She had spent her whole career believing that what a person chose to do when they were hurt, when they were dismissed, when someone looked straight at them and decided they were less, that choice was the whole story. Everything else was just details. She looked at Tommy sleeping against her shoulder, his dark eyelashes, his 12-year-old face, still soft with the last edges of childhood, not yet hardened into whatever the world would eventually ask him to be. She thought, when he wakes up, something will have happened that I will want him to know about for the rest of his life. She closed her book. She did not open it again, because she had heard the small, indistinct click of the galley interphone being lifted. She had heard it the way you hear small, precise sounds in quiet places, clearly and with the immediate understanding that it matters. Someone had called the cockpit. Ruth Calloway folded her hands in her lap, sat up very slightly straighter, and waited. She had always been very good at waiting. Captain David Okafor had been flying for United Airlines since the year 2000. He had started in the right seat, the first officer's seat, the co-pilot's chair, and worked his way to captain over 11 steady, quiet, excellent years. He was 48 years old. He had a wife named Amara who made him laugh harder than anyone on earth. He had 2 daughters and a son. He owned a house in the suburbs of Chicago that he was always planning to repaint, and somehow never quite got around to. He coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings when his schedule allowed, and took it only slightly less seriously than actual aviation. He made his grandmother's jerk chicken from a recipe she had given him entirely from memory, never once written down, and he lived in quiet, private terror of the day he might forget it. He had flown 214 transatlantic crossings. He had navigated hurricanes and instrument failures and the particular grinding exhaustion of a red-eye from Los Angeles to London, when your body is absolutely certain it is 3 in the morning, even though the sun is already rising gold and enormous over the southern tip of Greenland below you. He had held the hand of a woman giving birth somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. He had sat beside a man having a panic attack over Nebraska and talked to him slowly and steadily until the man's breathing came back and his hands unclenched, and he said, very quietly, "Thank you." The way people say thank you when they mean something much larger than the word contains. Captain David Okafor was not easily rattled. He was running routine systems checks with his first officer, a 29-year-old from Houston named James Delgado, when the interphone crackled. James had been awake since 4 in the morning. He was doing an admirable professional job of hiding it. The kind of job that young first officers learn to do early because aviation does not particularly care how tired you are. "Captain." It was Priya Sharma's voice, controlled, careful, the voice of someone choosing each word like stepping stones across cold water. "I wanted to make you aware we have a passenger in seat 22B. Captain Okafor kept his eyes on his instruments. "Copy, Priya. What's the situation?" A pause. The specific pause of someone who is deciding how much to say on a recorded line. "No situation, sir. I just thought you'd want to know." Another pause, shorter. "The passenger in 22B is Keanu Reeves." James Delgado looked up from his panel. Captain Okafor said nothing for a moment. "Copy that, Priya," he said finally. "Thank you." He replaced the interphone. He looked out through the cockpit windows at the absolute enormous blue of the sky at 34,000 feet. The sun was cutting sideways through the glass, warm and precise. Below them, on a flat country of white clouds, stretched in every direction like a world nobody had claimed yet. Clean and silent, and completely indifferent to everything happening inside this aircraft. James Delgado did not ask. He was experienced enough and wise enough to understand that some silences in a cockpit belong entirely to the captain. He went back to his instruments. Captain Okafor did not go back to his. He sat very still with his hands resting on his knees, and he looked at the sky and he thought about a Tuesday in February. 3 years earlier. Portland, Oregon. A rehabilitation hospital that smelled of antiseptic and something floral. Someone had brought yellow flowers to the room, he remembered that clearly. Yellow flowers in a white plastic vase. And he had stared at them for a long time, thinking how strange and how human it was to bring something bright and living into a place like this. His son's name was Michael. Michael Daniel Okafor. 23 years old in the February of 2016. An actor, trying to be one, honestly and bravely trying. Living in a Silver Lake studio apartment in Los Angeles with 2 roommates and a secondhand bicycle. And the specific luminous poverty of a young person who has chosen a dream in a city, absolutely crowded with people who have chosen the exact same dream. Michael had small parts. He had auditions. He had the kind of hope that is both beautiful and exhausting to witness in someone you love completely. In February of 2016, Michael had been driving south on the I-5 just outside Portland when another car crossed the center line. He had survived. That word, survived, carrying all of its complicated, heavy, double-edged weight. The spinal injury was what the doctors called incomplete. There was sensation. There was some movement. There was, they said carefully, a genuine possibility of significant recovery. Possibility. That word they use when they want to give you enough room to keep hoping without promising you anything real. Michael had spent 8 months in rehabilitation. Captain Okafor had visited every single weekend he was not in the air. He had sat in hard plastic chairs in hospital corridors. He had watched his son grip parallel bars with both hands and shake with the effort of holding his own weight, and he had kept his own hands very still and his own jaw very tight because there was nothing he could do except be present. And being present when you were helpless is the hardest thing a parent ever learns to do. Michael recovered. Not fully. A slight drag of his right foot that never fully resolved, that bothered Michael considerably more than it bothered anyone who loved him. He stopped pursuing acting. He moved back to Portland. He found work with a nonprofit helping young people find stable housing. He found, slowly and genuinely, a life that fit him properly. He had called his father on the day he moved into his new apartment. Standing in the kitchen of his own small place, looking out the window at the Portland rain moving gray and soft across the rooftops, he had told his father about something that had happened during those 8 months in rehabilitation, something Captain Okafor had never heard before, and something that involved a man in a gray hoodie who had taken a wrong turn down a hospital corridor one Tuesday afternoon in February and had not, when he found himself somewhere he wasn't expected, simply turned around and left. Captain Okafor had stood in his son's kitchen listening to that story with his hand flat on the counter and his eyes very still. When Michael finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Captain Okafor had made a promise. A quiet one. Private. The kind that lives inside you rather than being announced to anyone. If I ever have the chance? He had not finished the thought then. He hadn't needed to. The rest of it was understood, the way certain things between fathers and sons are understood without being fully spoken. Now, at 34,000 feet over Kansas, the man at the center of that unfinished promise was sitting in seat 22B of his aircraft, in a gray hoodie, reading meditations, asking for nothing. Captain Okafor sat with that for one long, full minute. Then he reached for the interphone. "James," he said quietly, "you have the aircraft." James Delgado straightened almost imperceptibly in his seat. "I have the aircraft," he confirmed. Captain David Okafor unclipped his harness. He set it aside carefully. He stood up in the low cockpit, rolled his shoulders once, and walked to the cockpit door. He opened it. He stepped through. There is an unwritten rule in aviation, unwritten but iron-hard and universally understood, that a captain does not leave the cockpit during a flight without a reason that can be found somewhere in a manual. Safety, medical emergency, a situation requiring immediate command presence in the cabin. You do not leave the cockpit for a passenger. You do not leave because someone interests you or moves you or reminds you of something you promised yourself on a rainy afternoon in a kitchen in Portland. The cockpit is the most important room on the aircraft, and the captain is its most important person. And those two things belong together for the duration of the flight. James Delgado had been flying for 6 years. He had served under 9 different captains. He had never once seen a captain leave the cockpit mid-flight for a reason that was not written, somewhere in precise official language. He said nothing. He trusted Captain Okafor completely, the way you trust someone whose steadiness you have watched up close in difficult moments and found to be absolutely real. And he held the aircraft. In the forward galley, Priya Sharma was restacking cups with the focused, methodical calm of someone who uses small physical tasks to manage large internal feelings. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. She had been a flight attendant for 3 years, and she had learned early that the cabin was a room where your feelings belonged entirely to you, and your professionalism belonged entirely to everyone else. She looked up when she heard the cockpit door. Captain Okafor stepped into the galley, his white shirt bright under the cabin lights, his dark eyes already moving past her, already knowing where he was going. Her eyes asked a question. He answered it by walking past her without stopping. She understood immediately. She set down her cups. She fell into step a few feet behind him. Not because he had asked, not because it was in any manual, but because she was good at her job, and her job right now was to be present for whatever this moment was going to become. The cabin noticed. This is the particular truth about the inside of a plane that people forget until they are in one. It is a small, sealed, intimate world. A flying village of strangers who are, for these few hours, closer to each other than they are to anyone they actually know. And in a small, sealed world, you feel immediately when something is happening that does not belong to the normal order of things. A cockpit door opening mid-flight, a captain in the aisle, the sound of deliberate footsteps moving with purpose in a space where purposeful movement almost always means something. Row 30. A man in a window seat pulled his earbuds out with one finger and watched. Row 28. And a woman looked up from her laptop and did not look back down. Row 26. 2 college students nudged each other without a word, both already watching. Row 25. A small girl in a pink cardigan knelt up on her seat facing backward, her chin resting on her folded arms on the headrest, wide eyes tracking the captain the way children track anything that feels important and new. Marcus Holt saw him coming from row 23. He sat up straighter. He adjusted his cuffs. His first thought, the immediate, self-centered, completely automatic thought of a man who had spent years considering himself the most relevant person in most rooms, was that the captain was coming to handle the situation, to address the clothing matter properly. He had pressed the call button after all. He had raised a concern through the correct channels. Things were, apparently, being managed at the highest level. He settled his watch on his wrist. He waited. Row 24. Row 23. Captain Okafor did not slow down at row 23. He did not glance at Marcus Holt. He did not acknowledge the aisle seat or the expensive watch or the man who had decided, 40 minutes ago, that the person in front of him was not worth his respect. He stopped at row 22. Ruth Calloway, who had not turned a single page in nearly 30 minutes, lowered her book completely to her lap, both hands, all the way down, her eyes very bright and very still behind her glasses. Tommy was awake now. He had been awake for the last 4 minutes, watching the captain walk the aisle with the enormous, undisguised, completely unself-conscious fascination of a 12-year-old boy who has not yet learned to pretend he is not watching something extraordinary. And he leaned forward slowly, his blue blanket bunching around his waist, both hands gripping the armrests. Keanu Reeves looked up from his book. Captain David Okafor extended his right hand. "Sir," he said, and his voice was full and warm and completely steady, the voice of a man who has rehearsed this moment only inside himself but finds, now that it is here, that he does not need the rehearsal. "It is a true honor to have you on my flight today." The cabin was absolutely silent, not the ordinary quiet of people minding their own business. Something deeper than that. The specific silence that falls when a room full of strangers simultaneously understands that they are witnessing something that matters. Keanu looked at the hand. He looked at the man behind it. Something moved across his face. Surprise, yes. A real and unguarded surprise. But underneath the surprise, something softer and older. The expression of a man who had spent years doing things quietly, asking for nothing back, and was not entirely sure what to do with himself when the quiet was interrupted by something this genuine. He reached up. He took the captain's hand. He shook it. "Thank you," Keanu said. His voice quieter than the captain's. Sincere in the way that only very simple words can be sincere. "That's really kind of you." They held the handshake one beat longer than handshakes usually last. One beat that the entire cabin felt and nobody spoke into. Then Captain Okafor said, his voice dropping lower now, "Private, meant only for the man in seat 22. I wonder, if you'd be willing, if I might tell you something, not here, after we land. Why, if you could wait by the gate." Keanu Reeves looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Something passed between them that had no name and needed none. "Of course," Keanu said. Marcus Holt's hand had stopped moving on his watch entirely. Ruth Calloway's eyes were very bright. Tommy's mouth was open. He closed it eventually. But it took a while. Ruth Calloway noticed, and in any other moment she might have reminded him quietly that mouths are for closing, because that was the kind of thing grandmothers notice and say. But she did not say it this time. This time she let the boy sit with his mouth open and his eyes wide, and his whole 12-year-old face completely undefended against the thing he had just witnessed, because some moments deserve to land on a person without anyone tidying them up. She understood. Yes, with the deep and certain knowledge of a woman who had spent her whole life around young people, that Tommy would remember this seat, this plane, this exact Tuesday afternoon for the rest of his life. She wanted him to feel it fully while it was still happening. The last hour of the flight was the longest hour. The cabin had a different quality to it after Captain Okafor walked back to the cockpit. Not louder, actually quieter somehow, in the way that a room stays quiet after a piece of music has ended. Not empty, but full of what was just there. People put their earbuds back in slowly. The woman with the laptop went back to her screen but did not type anything for a long time. The two college students in row 25 spoke to each other in low voices, glancing occasionally toward row 22. The small girl in the pink cardigan turned back around in her seat and immediately whispered something to her mother. Priya Sharma moved through the cabin on her final service round with the same smooth professionalism as always. But there was something different in how she moved now. Lighter somehow. As though something that had been sitting on her shoulders since the interphone call had been quietly lifted off. Marcus Holt spent the last hour in a silence that had an entirely different texture than the silence before. He did not press the call button. He did not adjust his watch. He did not make any further observations about the appropriateness of the people seated near him. He sat with his arms pulled in close to his own body and his face aimed at the seat back in front of him, wearing the expression of a man who is doing a very thorough and not particularly enjoyable inventory of himself. He had not known it was Keanu Reeves. He repeated this to himself several times with great sincerity. He had genuinely, truly not known. He also knew, in the place underneath that, the honest place that exists in most people whether they visit it often or not, that it did not matter, not really. Not in the way that counted. He had looked at a man in a worn gray hoodie and decided within 30 seconds and without a single conversation that the man was worth less than him. The hoodie had been the evidence. The verdict had arrived almost instantly, and the verdict would have been exactly the same whether the man in 22B was Keanu Reeves or a schoolteacher from Ohio, or a construction worker from Queens, or anyone else who chose comfort over appearance on a Tuesday morning flight. That was the part that sat in his chest like a cold stone. Not that he had been caught, but what he had been caught doing. He pressed his temple against the cool plastic of the window and watched the landscape of the American West slide by 34,000 feet below. The brown geometry of desert, the silver thread of a distant highway, the shadow of the plane moving across it all like a small, dark thought crossing a very large mind. He did not sleep. Ruth Calloway did close her eyes in the last 40 minutes, her breathing slow and even, one hand resting lightly on Tommy's armrest. Tommy stayed awake. He looked at the back of seat 22B. He looked at the gray hoodie visible just above the headrest. He looked at the worn canvas strap of the backpack tucked under the seat. He did not fully understand everything that had happened, but he understood enough. He was 12, not an infant. He understood that a man in a very important uniform had walked the length of a plane to shake the hand of a man that another man had publicly decided was beneath him. He understood what that meant, even if he didn't yet have all the words for it. He thought about it so hard and so quietly that he did not notice Ruth's eyes had opened again, and she was watching him think. She smiled to herself. He was going to be all right, this boy. When the fasten seatbelt sign illuminated and the nose of the aircraft tilted its first degree toward Los Angeles, the cabin came back to life in the familiar, slightly chaotic way of a plane, beginning its descent. Tray tables folding, bags rustling, the particular communal urgency of people who have been sitting still for 5 hours and can smell the end of it. Priya Sharma moved down the aisle collecting the last of the cups and wrappers. She paused at row 22. She did not say anything. She simply looked at the man in the gray hoodie, directly for just a moment, the way you look at someone when you want them to know they were seen, and gave him a small, single nod. He looked up. He nodded back. It was a small thing. 2 people and a nod at 15,000 feet over the San Gabriel Mountains. But small things in the right moment between the right people have a way of being the opposite of small. United Airlines Flight 863 touched down at Los Angeles International Airport at exactly 4:47 in the afternoon, Pacific Time. The October sky over LAX was that particular shade of Los Angeles blue that leans slightly toward gold at the edges, the sun beginning its long, unhurried lean toward the Pacific Ocean somewhere beyond the runway. The wheels met the tarmac with the clean, solid thunk of a safe landing. Passengers did what passengers do. They stood before the seatbelt sign went off. They jammed into the aisle. They yanked bags from overhead compartments with the enthusiasm of people who have been asked to sit still for 5 hours and have reached the absolute outer limit of their compliance. Keanu Reeves waited. He always waited for the aisle to clear. He always let the rush go first. It was not a performance. And it was not patience performed for an audience. It was simply how he moved through spaces, without urgency, without entitlement, without the need to be first out the door. A family 4 rows ahead gathered the scattered evidence of their children's in-flight entertainment. A crayon rolling under a seat, a small stuffed bear wedged between armrests, a juice cup that had somehow ended up 3 rows back. Ruth Calloway helped Tommy shrug into his backpack with the practiced ease of a grandmother who has been helping children with backpacks for decades. As she straightened up, she looked at seat 22B, already empty. She looked toward the front of the plane. The gray hoodie, the worn boots, the canvas backpack over one shoulder, the man moving slowly with the last of the stragglers toward the jetway. She touched Tommy's arm. "Yeah, remember this," she said. "Just that. Nothing more." She did not explain what this was. She trusted him to carry it. Tommy looked at her. Then he looked toward the front of the plane. "I will," he said. And he meant it. At Terminal 7, just beyond the mouth of the jetway, where the arriving passengers from Flight 863 spread out into the wide, bright, indifferent noise of LAX, a man in a gray hoodie with a worn backpack and scuffed brown boots stood quietly to one side and waited. He waited for 10 minutes. He waited without looking at his phone, without shifting his weight impatiently, without doing anything at all except standing still in the middle of the moving world and waiting. Then he saw the captain coming down the jetway. David Okafor had changed out of his uniform jacket. White shirt now, a small carry-on bag rolling behind him. He looked different without the jacket. Not smaller, but more human somehow. More like a father and less like a captain, which was, at this particular moment, exactly what he was. He saw Keanu immediately. He stopped. They looked at each other across 10 feet of airport floor. Ruth Calloway, moving slowly toward the exit the way people move when they are hoping to be present for something without intruding on it, also stopped. She took Tommy's arm gently. Tommy stopped beside her without being asked. Captain David Okafor walked forward. "My name is David Okafor," he said. "My son's name is Michael." Keanu Reeves looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Something quiet and deep and old. "I think I know," Keanu said softly. "What you're going to tell me." Captain David Okafor looked at him for a long moment. Now the airport moved around them the way airports always move. Loud and purposeful and completely indifferent to the small, still pocket of silence that had formed between these two men near Gate 47 of Terminal 7. Roller bags rattled past. A child ran laughing toward a grandfather with open arms. An announcement echoed from somewhere overhead in the flat, cheerful voice of airport announcements everywhere. None of it touched them. "Then you remember," Captain Okafor said. "It wasn't a question." Keanu was quiet. He shifted the canvas backpack slightly on his shoulder. He looked at the captain the way he had looked at him on the plane. Directly, fully, without any of the performance of looking. Just genuine attention. The kind that is rarer than people think. "Portland," Keanu said. "February." Captain Okafor nodded once. Slowly. "In February," he confirmed. And then, because some stories need to be told out loud to become fully real, because some things that happened in private deserve, at least once, to be spoken in the open air between the person who gave something and the person whose family received it, Captain David Okafor told the story. In February of 2016, Michael Okafor was 23 years old and lying in a rehabilitation hospital in Portland, Oregon, trying to decide whether the rest of his life was worth the effort of living it. That is a hard sentence. It is supposed to be hard. The truth of it was hard. For Michael, for his father flying transatlantic routes and calling every day from hotel rooms in London and Frankfurt, and for his mother, Amara, who drove up from Chicago and slept in a chair beside his bed for the first 2 weeks and never once complained about the chair. He had been moved from the ICU to the rehabilitation ward 8 days after the accident. The doctors were cautiously optimistic in the precise, measured way that doctors learn to be cautious when they are also genuinely uncertain. The spinal injury was incomplete, which meant sensation, which meant some movement, which meant a real possibility of significant recovery. But possibility is a cold word when you are 23, and the thing in question is your own body, the one you have lived in your entire life and suddenly cannot trust. Michael stopped wanting visitors after the second week. Not because he didn't love the people who came, but because he could not bear the specific, suffocating weight of being looked at by people who loved him, and seeing the hope in their faces and knowing that hope could still go terribly wrong. He needed the visits to stop so he could stop performing okayness for everyone else and just be wherever he actually was. He was alone a great deal. He read. He stared at the ceiling tiles and counted them. He did the exercises his physical therapist assigned him. A warm, endlessly patient woman named Diane, who had seen every variety of grief that a body can carry, and never once made him feel pitied. With the grim, mechanical efficiency of a person, completing tasks he has not yet decided matter. On a Tuesday afternoon in late February, he was in the rehabilitation gym. It was a wide, bright room. Rubber floors the color of a rainy day, and parallel bars running in 2 clean lines down the center. Resistance equipment along the walls. The particular charged, quiet energy of a place where people fight battles every single day that do not look, from the outside, like battles at all. Michael was working on standing. Just standing. Holding his own weight between the parallel bars, his hands gripping the smooth metal, his right leg shaking with the effort of a thing his body had done automatically since he was 11 months old and was now having to learn completely from the beginning, like a language he had somehow forgotten overnight. He was exhausted in the way that goes past the body, past the muscles and the nerves and the shaking leg. The kind of tired that settles somewhere behind the sternum and makes everything, with the gym, the bars, the rubber floor, the rest of the day, even the rest of the year, all of it, feel like an almost unreasonable amount of effort. He heard the door. He did not look up immediately. People came and went from the rehabilitation gym. Doctors, therapists, orderlies. Family members with careful faces and careful voices who stood at the edges of the room and watched and tried very hard not to look like they were watching. But the footsteps were different. Not the soft-souled footsteps of hospital staff. Not the careful, apologetic footsteps of a visiting family member. These were unhurried, quiet but present. The footsteps of someone who was comfortable in their own body moving through an unfamiliar space. Michael looked up. The man standing just inside the doorway of the rehabilitation gym was tall. He wore a dark gray hoodie and blue jeans and boots that had seen considerable use. He had a worn backpack on one shoulder, and the kind of face that was both immediately recognizable and somehow in person, completely without the armor that fame usually builds around a person. He had clearly taken a wrong turn. The elevator bank was in the opposite direction. He had been on his way somewhere else entirely, in the pediatric ward, as it would later be understood, where he had been spending the afternoon doing what he did in hospitals, which was simply showing up and sitting with sick children and asking them questions and listening to the answers with his complete, unhurried attention. He had taken a wrong turn and ended up here instead. He looked at the parallel bars, he looked at the young man gripping them, jaw set, right leg trembling with the enormous effort of standing in one place. He could have apologized for the intrusion and left. He was in a space he had no business being in, a private space meant for patients doing private, difficult work. The correct and sensible thing was to back out through the door and find the elevator bank and continue with his afternoon. He did not leave. He looked around the room. He found a chair against the wall, a plain plastic chair, the kind that exists in every institutional space on Earth. He walked to it. He sat down. He set his backpack on the floor beside his boots. He did not introduce himself. He did not say anything at all. He simply sat there, present, quiet, unhurried, like a person who had been planning to sit in exactly that chair all along. Michael stared at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rehabilitation gym was very quiet. The only sounds were the faint mechanical hum of the building, and Michael's own unsteady breathing and the distant, muffled sounds of the hospital going about its enormous, complicated business beyond the closed door. Then the man in the gray hoodie looked directly at Michael and said, "How are you doing?" Not with the careful, padded, sideways delivery of someone managing a difficult situation. Not with the lowered eyes and softened voice of pity. Just directly, plainly. The way you ask someone how they are doing when you actually want to know. Michael's hands tightened on the parallel bars, and then, because the question was so plain and so direct and so completely without performance, and because he had been performing okayness for 3 weeks and was exhausted all the way down to his bones with the effort of it, he answered honestly, "I don't know if I want to keep going," he said. He did not mean the exercises. The man in the gray hoodie looked at him for a long time. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He did not immediately reach for reassurance or advice or the particular kind of cheerful redirection that people use when an honest answer makes them uncomfortable. He sat with it, fully, the way very few people know how to sit with something hard. Then he said, "I know what that feels like." 4 words. Spoken without drama, without performance, without the need to make them mean more than they meant. Just the plain truth of them, offered directly to another person who needed to hear that someone else had stood in a similar dark place and was still here to say so. Michael looked at him. "The pain doesn't always go away," the man continued, and his voice quiet and even. "Sometimes it stays, but you get bigger than it, you grow around it. And one day you look back and realize that the thing that almost stopped you, that thing is also the reason you understand what you're actually for." The rehabilitation gym was completely still. "I don't know what I'm for," Michael said. His voice was very young. It was the voice of someone who has not had enough time yet to find out. The man nodded slowly, as though this was the most reasonable and honest thing anyone had said to him in a long time. "That's the whole job," he said. "Finding out. Everything else is just showing up." He stayed for 45 minutes. He stayed until Michael had completed his full exercise set. He stayed through Diane returning to the gym and stopping in the doorway with wide eyes and then, reading the room with the skilled intuition of an experienced therapist, quietly proceeding as though nothing unusual was happening. He stayed through the shaking and the effort, and the rest between sets, and Michael gradually, almost imperceptibly, standing a little more steadily in the last set than he had in the first. When Diane helped Michael toward the door at the end of the session, the man in the gray hoodie stood. He crossed the room. He shook Michael's hand at the door, a firm, real handshake, the kind between equals. He asked for nothing. He left no number. He made no request for privacy or secrecy. He simply gathered his backpack from beside the chair and walked back into the corridor to find the elevator bank and continue with his afternoon. He never told anyone. At Gate 47 in Terminal 7 at Los Angeles International Airport, Captain David Okafor's voice had gone very quiet by the end. Not broken. He was not a man who broke easily, but quiet in the way that voices go quiet when they are carrying something that took a long time to get here. Michael recovered, he said. Not entirely. He walks with a slight drag in his right foot. It bothers him more than it bothers anyone who loves him. A breath. He works for a nonprofit in Portland now, helping young people find housing. He says... His jaw moved once. He says he found out what he's for. The airport continued its enormous, indifferent motion around them. Keanu Reeves had not moved. He had not looked away. He had listened the way he always listened, with the whole of himself, without reservation, the way most people only listen when they are waiting for something to end. His eyes were very bright. He never needed to know my name, Keanu said, and his voice was almost too quiet to hear beneath the airport noise. He just needed someone to sit down. Captain Okafor nodded. He calls me every Sunday, he said. Every single week. He always ends the call the same way. He paused. He says, Dad, I found out what I'm for. The words hung in the air between them. Ruth Calloway, 20 feet away with her hand pressed flat and still against her own sternum, closed her eyes for just a moment. Tommy stood beside her and did not say a single word and was, without knowing it, becoming someone. Captain David Okafor extended his hand for the second time that day. Keanu Reeves took it. This handshake lasted even longer than the first. Marcus Holt collected his bag from the baggage carousel in silence. He walked to the taxi stand. He did not speak to anyone. He sat in the back of the cab and watched Los Angeles slide past the window. The palm trees, the overpasses, the long flat light of late afternoon. And he thought about a man in a gray hoodie who had sat in an economy seat and read a book about grace and asked for nothing from anyone. He thought about the word appropriate. He is not the villain of this story. He is something more uncomfortable than a villain. He is a mirror. The kind that most of us, if we are being honest with ourselves in the quiet places, have looked into at least once and seen something we would rather not name out loud. He went home to Greenwich. He sat in his very nice house surrounded by his very nice things. He did not sleep well that night. He has not, by certain accounts, looked at a stranger's clothing the same way since. Ruth Calloway told Tommy everything on the drive to her daughter's house in Pasadena, the city lights beginning to come on around them in the early evening. Tommy listened with the total, serious, wide-open attention of a boy, storing something carefully away for later. He is 16 now. He volunteers every Saturday morning at a rehabilitation hospital in Bozeman. When people ask him why, he tells them his grandmother showed him something on a plane once. He never needs more words than that. Captain David Okafor flew home to Chicago 2 days later. He coached soccer that weekend. He made his grandmother's jerk chicken entirely from memory and got it almost exactly right. He called Michael on Sunday. Michael was well. Michael was wonderful. Michael ended the call the way he always ended it. Dad, I found out what I'm for. And Keanu Reeves went to his meeting the next morning. Early. Quiet. The kind of meeting that never needed a first-class seat to mean something. He wore the gray hoodie. He carried the worn canvas backpack. He held the door open for a janitor on his way into the building. The janitor said thank you. Keanu said no, thank you, and meant it completely, the way he meant everything, all the way down. He asked for nothing. He never did. Before you go, drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching this from. I want to know. Whether you are in New York or New Delhi, London or Lagos, Bozeman or Beirut, tell me your city down below. Every single comment gets read. And if this story moved you even a little, if it made you think twice about the person sitting next to you on a bus, in a waiting room, pod on a plane, then do one small thing right now. Hit that like button. Not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, but because every click helps this story reach one more person who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that kindness is worth spreading. We find these stories, the quiet ones, the real ones, the ones that happen without cameras and press releases and people asking for credit, and we bring them to you.